Ascendo they've been around for quite a while. They used to, a long time ago, focus on sort of rather esoteric hi-fi speakers, the sorts of speakers that they would demonstrate at the Munich high-end hi-fi show. And outside of those kind of high-end hi-fi aficionados, they weren't terribly well known, but they have over the past few years branched out into home theatre in a big way. And the way most people, and the way I came to hear of Ascendo in the first place, is by seeing one of their subwoofers. And if you look at the review, you can see a picture of the 50-inch subwoofer, which was the first time I ever came across Ascendo. I was at a hi-fi show and I walked past the 50-inch subwoofer and I stopped in my tracks and wondered, hang on about, who's this? Who's producing a 50-inch subwoofer? So that's how most people tend to come across Ascendo. They now have a huge portfolio of specifically home theatre targeted speakers and subwoofers, and they're rebranded as Ascendo Immersive Audio. And the way they do things is unlike anyone. I think I would probably go as far as saying, in that their speakers, which are mostly very high end and sort of custom installation focused, tend to, at the upper end, be active or with their own inbuilt amplification. And their subwoofer range, they divide in two. So they have subwoofers, which I think they like to call kick subs. Most people would just call them subwoofers, that play the range around sort of 27 hertz and up. And they have infrasonic subs, which play below that, down to single digits. And the 50-inch, as you might imagine, it falls into the infrasonic subwoofer category. They actually make an 80-inch as well, which is so obscenely, ridiculously large that...
Yeah, but you could feel like Marty McFly, though, couldn't you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They don't even make a cabinet for it. That's how big it is. So if you want it in your cinema, they have to build a room for it. It's like a cement bunker that they have to build for the rear of it. So it's only for the most obscenely, ridiculously multi-million-pound home theatre installations that's aimed at. This package that I tested was, to coin Ed Selly's, in his absence, term, slightly more terrestrial adjacent, as he likes to say. In that it's still a 10 grand speaker package, but it's nowhere near the cost of, it as a package. It's still not as expensive as their entry level infrasonic sub. So it's very much entry level in Ascendo terms. It's still very expensive, so most people wouldn't regard it as entry level. And the system I tested was their 10-inch passive on walls, or they can be used in wall as well, and their 6.5-inch surrounds. Had 4 of those used as surround backs, and 2 12-inch subs, which at the time of review was called the SV12, but they've since rebranded to call it the 12 sub. So there's no real imagination really in their naming convention. There's the 10p is the 10-inch passive, the 6p is the 6.5-inch passive, and the 12-inch subs. So aside from their sort of twin approach to infrasonic and kick subs, the other very unusual thing about Ascendo speakers is, well, twofold. One, they are absolutely ridiculously efficient, and their output is like, short of going for actual pro cinema speakers, I don't think you can get this sort of output at the price. I think the Ascendo, the 10p, is probably the highest output speaker at this price. Someone will probably find another speaker that I'm not thinking of, but they are 97 dB efficient and handle up to 500 watts. So if you put that into any sort of SPL calculator, you realize that pretty well at any reasonable listening distance, you can hit THX reference 105 dB with quite a lot of headroom. So it's a staggering amount of output. The 6.5 inch, they will hit THX reference levels at a 3 meter listening distance. These are tiny. They're actually 88 millimeters deep that go on the wall, and they will hit reference levels at that sort of distance. And that's output that most speakers can't keep up with, really. Unless you spend serious money. Most home theatre speakers just don't have that sort of output. And the Ascendos do, and they're relatively entry-level priced. The trade-off for that is they roll off their bass at around 80 hertz. They don't attempt to produce any bass, being as they're a subsat system. They're purely intended for use with the subwoofer. So that's probably a worthwhile trade-off in my view, because you should be using subwoofers, certainly in a home theatre system. And I'd rather have the higher output capability with the headroom. And that's the Ascendo approach. The other really interesting part of their design is they are all coaxial drivers. And what that means is Tannoy have been doing this for years. And Kef do it as well. Famed for their coaxial drivers. So what a coaxial driver essentially is it locates the high frequency transducer in the middle of the low frequency woofer. Usually it fires through an acoustically transparent dust cap in the center of the woofer. And all the Ascendo speakers do that. And there are two big benefits of that. One is the single woofer, the single point source, is geometrically symmetrical in every direction, and so sound radiates symmetrically in every direction, slightly different on axis, just because the design of the transducer. But everything other than on axis, it's symmetrical. And one of the big advantages of that is they're incredibly easy and amenable to EQ, because if you change the frequency response in one direction, the mirror image happens at the opposite direction. So you can EQ every direction sort of simultaneously. So what you find is when you try and EQ them, they respond almost perfectly to the changes, which isn't the case with most other speakers. It's a bit of trial and error. The other big benefit of the point source, which Ascendo are at pains to explain, is traditional speakers locate the tweeter and the woofer separately. And what that results in is very slight timing differences in the time it takes for the sound from those two drivers to reach your ear, depending on where you're sitting relative to those two drivers, because there's sort of path distance differences between the distance from those two drivers will change depending on where you're sitting, and which means the timing will change ever so slightly. And what Ascendo say, and they make a very compelling argument around this, is that the human ear uses timing differences to locate things in space, to spatially localize things. You hear the difference in time between your two ears that a sound takes, and then you can position it fairly accurately. Normally on the horizontal plane is where you're most accurate. And the human ear is incredibly acute at its ability to position things. And Ascendo would argue that the slight timing differences you get with conventional speakers slightly smear the cues to your ears about localization. So you can't precisely localize images as accurately with a sort of two or multi-way driver system as you can with a single point source that emanates everything in a time coherent way from one particular source. And as a result, with the single point source speaker, you are able to, they image more precisely, essentially. You're able to spatially locate objects more precisely. And I mean, that was my experience. Like, it absolutely lived up to that. In terms of the overall presentation, without EQ, I found it almost painfully bright. They're definitely needing EQ. They are certainly warts and all speakers. You need to tame them ever so slightly. Once tamed, they are incredibly detailed. Just like this, they have this layered spatial, hugely dense sound field, unlike anything else I've tested, which is essentially what Ascendo have argued is the coaxial nature of their speakers, coupled with the high output, leads to this greater immersiveness. And as I say, that's exactly what I found. Their output capability just meant there was as much headroom on tap as any sane person could want. My ears would give in well before these would be breaking a sweat. And they do all of that in a very sort of slight form factor, very easy to accommodate in more or less any room. I mean, they're not the prettiest speakers. They are black cuboids with a black grill that goes in the front.
They remind me of the JBL professional range. They look very, very similar with that kind of finish, where they're supposed to go behind acoustically transparent screens and wall surfaces, aren't they?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So, I mean, Ascendo really grew out of the custom install market, and that's where they're really focusing a lot of their efforts and huge amounts of traction. Like Trinov are demoing their latest waveforming tech with an all Ascendo system in Cedia later this year. And I think Trinov have used them for previous demos, and the custom install market love Ascendo at the moment, and they are branching out steadily into the more consumer side, and this system is really evidence of that. And I can't think of a system that is price comparable that I think can equal this. Really,
do we know who's distributing them in the UK where people can? Probably it's Karma AV, is it? Okay, so they should be available for people to demo, certainly through Karma. So if you are interested in that, go read Doug's review. It is up on the site. Doug, remind me when I put that up. Was that this week?
Today.
It was today, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was today.